So I wanted to start out by asking you about a piece that you've recently written for Monkey Cage, which is at the Washington Post, and ask you to just give a bit of a sort of overview of the findings. What did you find about young people's political engagement in this moment?
Sure. So PRRI teamed up with MTV to do a survey of young Americans aged 15 to 24 nationally. And what was striking in the data is that they found that young women were far more likely to participate in politics than young men. This is important because historically, men have always engaged more in politics than women have. And so for the first time, we see among this youngest generation, young women being more likely to go to rallies, to post stories about political news, to be even paying attention to news. And so this is a pretty interesting and novel change.
What about differences by other demographic characteristics, particularly race and ethnicity? Did you find any differences across groups when you were looking at young people's engagement?
Well, what was interesting is that the gender gap that I found in the data, which showed that more young women were participating than young men, was apparent through all these different racial categories. So young women of color, African American women, Latina women, Asian women were more likely to participate in politics than their male counterparts, which I think is pretty interesting. And I think there's often a stereotype that people of color are less engaged in politics, and these data show, at least among the youngest generation, that's not true. MTV and PRI asked a question about gender equality as a critical issue. And what it found was among women who said that gender equality was a critical issue, those women were by far the most engaged in political activity. So I think that young women have internalized a lot of lessons from the 2016 campaign and also into the Trump presidency.
So what does the data show? So you said there's more of the engagement, particularly on gender equality issues among Democratic women, but what about among Republicans, among Trump supporters, however that's measured? Does that level of engagement, is it consistent? And what does it mean for thinking about engagement in the fall election?
You know, that's a really good question. So the data that I looked at showed that young people who supported Trump or view Trump favorably are less engaged in politics right now. And I think more generally, the political enthusiasm tends to be on the political left. And so the data that I looked at with young Americans is showing a similar story.
So if you were running a campaign in 2018, what would you tell, or what would you tell your candidate to do to perhaps tap into that energy, especially it sounds like on the Democratic side?
Right. So I think to engage young Democratic women, they have to learn the lessons of what's going on in terms of the Me Too movement, in terms of gun rights, on all of those issues. Younger progressive women care deeply about those issues, and I think they resonate with those issues. And so I think Democratic candidates in particular would be wise to talk about and outreach to those group of women in particular. My hunch is that something seems to have awakened a lot of younger people, and they're unhappy with the status quo more generally. And so whether or not the Democrats can use that to their advantage, whether Republicans can successfully recruit some people to their side remains to be seen. But there definitely is a hunger for change and a hunger for getting rid of politics as usual.